she does it. Or that mother in South Sudan, whom I can imagine, who lives in the midst of a disintegrating world all around her, yet fights to see her daughter educated for a future that they can't even see right now. The same story takes 1,000 different forms: people overcoming addiction in their lives or dealing with it in the lives of their loved ones, those who face each day with hope and creativity despite the challenges of disability or disease, painful loss, or a terminal diagnosis. As a pastor, I'm often privileged to see the courageous struggles and hope-filled days that others do not see, lived out despite all the uncertainty of life. And I get to see those same people, many of you, quietly go out each day to live with deep care for the world and for the needs of others. So I'm not surprised that the gospel writer included this intimate story about the struggle of faith right in the middle of the good news about Jesus' powerful ministry in the world. And as the story goes on, we see the disciples, those who knew Jesus best and trusted him most. These were the people who knew Jesus, right? Out on the sea in the middle of the night, struggling against a wind which we are told batters them and threatens to submerge them. Now, I don't know if you've ever been at sea at night in a storm, but it's pretty terrifying. You can't see much at all. And it feels as if the pounding waters will never end, and if you're like me, you're probably seasick on top of that. It's not unlike the feeling people often have after a profound loss, or facing the daily grind of poverty or oppression, or I imagine the daily grind of racism. The pain of such things just keeps coming at you, wave after wave, with no end in sight. In the midst of the storm in Matthew's story, Jesus comes to his battered followers. He comes to them across the waves, already filled with fear, still not grasping the good news of God's unending love toward them. They think he's just a ghost. They're utterly terrified. Until he speaks those words of faith that are repeated over and over again in the scriptures. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. I am not a ghost, a malevolent spirit, or a vengeful God who must be appeased. Take heart. Be of good courage. It is I, he says, the one whom you know, who comes to you, fully human, yet full of the love of God. Don't be afraid. We hear those words over and over again in our scriptures, do not be afraid, but find it hard to absorb them for some reason. When we finally get to the heart of the story, which I think is all about the true nature of faith, Peter asks to walk on water, steps out of the boat, and begins to make his way to Jesus until, as you know, he noticed the wind, it says, and the depths of the sea beneath him, and he begins to sink beneath the weight of all of his fears. For some reason, we tend to think of this story as one that condemns us for having little faith. That's not what happens at all, in my opinion. When Peter begins to sink, Jesus doesn't abandon him or call him a cowardly loser. Jesus doesn't even tweet about it. Peter... Sorry. Peter wanted to be head of the church, but couldn't even handle the waves. Sad. But sorry, I couldn't resist that. Anyway, I got to start tweeting. It'd be so much fun. No, Jesus, the story says, reaches out and takes hold of Peter, takes hold of him and rescues him. The question, why did you doubt? I don't see that as condemning, but instructive. Why were you afraid? I already told you, it only takes faith the size of a tiny seed to move mountains, and you were right there taking your first steps across the sea. You don't have to be afraid. Finally, when the disciples realized who was with them, we're told the wind ceased and the seas went calm again. So to me, the point of this story is not to castigate us for lack of faith, just the opposite. It's to point out that even those who walked with Jesus, including St. Peter, I mean, come on, St. Peter, right, founder of the church, were often fearful and terrified. In this case, even in the midst of an amazing act of faith. I mean, Peter got out of the boat. That's faith, right? He was acting in faith and still experienced that sinking feeling we because that's part of the experience of faith. It's not all one direction. The truth is that like courage, faith is not fearlessness. Faith is taking that next step even when you're uncertain, even when you are afraid or terrified.